Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. I know it can be a little bit difficult to get yourself refocused after lunch, but it is nice to see a full room today. Welcome to this panel on gender equality in expert sources. This panel has been organized by United for News, which is a cross-sector movement of media, NGOs, and industry to support local news and increase trust in the media. It was launched by the World Economic Forum and Internews. My name is Melanie Walker, and I am Director of Media Development for the World Association of Newspapers and News Publishers. I am also the founder of Women in News, which is a global capacity building and advocacy initiative to increase women's voices and leadership in the news. We've had a number of panels focusing on diversity and inclusion throughout the festival, and I think that's really heartening to see. While they all have been sequestered in this room, they have been at capacity. I do join my colleague Julie Passetti's call to the festival organizers to move this thematic session to larger rooms next year. Obviously, there is an interest. This is something that is very relevant throughout the industry from many different angles, and we need a bigger room. Maybe not right now, but certainly the other panels that I've taken part in, all of which have been very dynamic and focused on a lot of interesting issues within the industry in terms of how we can collectively increase gender diversity in the media. This particular session focuses on expert sources, and some might wonder why we are focusing on what is rather narrow subject matter. It is a narrow subject matter, but it is one that forms part of a very crucial overall approach that must be taken, and we've heard from many esteemed speakers today and also yesterday about leadership strategies, organizational strategies, as well as strategies to keep this topic relevant and fresh and how to talk about it and keep it in the news. And this is all very important. But there is this other component of expert sources, and I'm going to quote some figures again, which have been quoted before, but for those who were not in the room earlier on today. And these are figures that came out from the Global Media Monitoring Project and are relevant as of 2015, so they are a couple of years dated, but distressingly, but probably for the purposes of this quoting this panel, it is also still relevant. They have not moved in 20 years, so these figures that I'm quoting now are the same as they were 20 years ago. 24% of the people seen, heard, or read about in the news are women, and only 19% of those subject matter experts. So less than 20% of the women or of expert sources that appear in the news are women. And again, this has not budged in over 2 decades. When women do appear in the news, it is they are twice as likely to be portrayed as victims than their male counterparts. And when they have their views expressed, it is most often to share their personal experiences or as an eyewitness rather than as authoritative voices. So not only are women generally absent from the news, but when we do make an appearance, it is more often in a way that perpetuates outdated stereotypes and gendered stereotypes. Putting aside the obvious point that this is bad for the media industry as well as society, this is bad for business. We're going to unpack this a little bit in this panel as well. It is bad for business. People want to see themselves reflected in the news that they read, in the content produced, and the people they're seeing on screen, and this extends to expert sources. So we are really going to get into this in more detail. And what we'd really like to achieve as part of this panel session, and certainly we'll encourage your questions after the panelists have spoken and shared a little bit, is we want to share some practical tips and strategies for newsrooms and for individual journalists and editors to increase that percentage of 19%, to find those other 81% that are out there to increase that balance in the news. And so our panelists will share this. It doesn't need to be expensive. It doesn't need to be a huge initiative, and it certainly doesn't need to have a massive investment from a technological point of view. In some cases, like that of Bloomberg, it has been an incredibly overarching business strategy to approach, and we'll hear more from our panelist Laura Zelenko, who will share just how that has resulted. But there are different ways to approach it. We appreciate that some of the panelists speaking today are from large organizations, but also in the case that Ross will get into in more detail, his initiative was very much individually driven and self-motivated and did not cost a lot of money. It's now expanded and I think has much more organizational support behind it. So without further ado, I will introduce our panelists today. Beside me is Laura Zelenko, and she is Senior Executive Editor with Bloomberg Editorial and Research. Laura is responsible for helping to make Bloomberg a global leader for newsroom diversity and inclusivity and ensuring fairness and balance across all editorial platforms and in all forms of content. That's a big mandate. Bloomberg has built diversity and inclusion into their business strategy, and as a result has become a recognized leader in the industry for championing gender equality and also holding itself to account to do better. As the editorial lead for the media business, Laura is helping to create diversity franchise that includes television, podcasts, as well as print staff, writing about diversity and inclusion issues in themselves. So welcome, Laura. We're delighted to have you here today. Our second panelist is Jenny Holm, and Jenny is program manager with Internews. Internews is an international nonprofit organization working to expand freedom of expression and access to high-quality news and information. Jenny currently serves as the Deputy Chief of Party for USAID's Balkan Media Assistance Program covering Bosnia and Herzegovina, Kosovo, Macedonia, Montenegro, and Serbia. You're busy. The program aims to make media practitioners more competitive in the local and regional marketplace and strengthen the sustainability of the independent media sector across the region. Welcome, Jenny. Last but not least, our third panelist is Ross Atkins, creator and presenter of Outside Source BBC. He is also the creator of the pioneering 50/50 project, which is helping the BBC move towards an equal representation of women and men in its content. Ross's story provides an excellent example of how one person's focus and efforts can improve gender balance, can have that amplified impact throughout the organization. After its successes at the BBC, the 50/50 project has now partnered with other media organizations in America and Europe, and we'll hear more about that as well. Welcome, Ross. So let's dive in, and I think a good place to start is around problem identification, and that is the first step to working toward resolution. And so I'd like to ask each of you, beginning with you, Ross, when did you first recognize this lack of expert female sources that was something that needed to change, and how through the work that you've been doing in your organization, how are you addressing this challenge?
So I think I've been aware of the underrepresentation of women in BBC journalism since I arrived, which was 2001, so that's quite a long time ago. I've been a network anchor for about 15 years, and so I've presented a lot of programs, and I was acutely aware that the vast majority of programs I presented had many more men in them than women, and I was kind of building up a head of steam. I had quite a lot of fire in my belly on this, and was kind of aware that if I just went round shouting and screaming at people and saying, why are we not doing better on this, that probably wasn't going to be particularly persuasive. And so with regards to identifying problems, in 2016 I thought, okay, well, let's try and be practical about this. Let's not go around lecturing people. Let's try and think what we could do. And I made a list of all the things, all the reasons why people would say they couldn't do this. So they would say, it's not possible. So I decided to prove that it was on my program. They say, we haven't got time, we're too busy, so I created a system that could be embedded into their working practices, which didn't take very long. They would say this is going to compromise the quality of our journalism, so I started collecting examples of how when you diversify the sources in your journalism, you don't lower the quality, and I would argue that you increase it. And they would also say, management just don't understand what we're dealing with in the newsroom. We're busy, we've got stories, we've got deadlines, management's coming along saying, why don't you consider all of these diversity targets? And for right or for wrong, people were quite resistant to that. So the final idea I had was, well, what would happen if you made this voluntary? What would happen if the only people who got involved were doing it if they chose to, and then if they chose to not do it, they could just stop? And by identifying those problems and building that into the project that I wanted to create, it immediately addressed a lot of the problems that I knew I'd encounter as I spoke to people, and that proved to be reasonably effective. And so I spent the first 6 months proving this system worked on my program. Once we had a bank of data and we could show that you could make a mainstream news program with 50% women sources, I started talking to a few others. But it was always with the tone of, look, if you don't want to do this, it's fine, you don't have to. And we started on my program in 2017, and I checked this morning, I think we're on 470 BBC content teams with 4,000 journalists, so, and all of them can stop at any point. So at the very beginning, taking the time to list all the concerns my colleagues would have and making sure I had solid answers to them put me in pretty good shape.
Thank you. Okay, over to you, Jenny.
Sure. The problem of the lack of women's voices in media is something that Internews has been aware of for many, many years, and something that we've been trying to address in various ways throughout our programs, from trying to get an equal number or more women in the trainings that we do around the world, and sometimes that involves actually sending out a local community liaison to women's homes to speak with their fathers or brothers or whoever about the importance of them taking part in this in some societies. It is encouraging the outlets we work with to portray women in non-stereotypical ways and to do the extra legwork to find women to source. But we really didn't start addressing the problem of women in sourcing in a systematic way until we began working with these partners here around the table and others on the United for News initiative. We founded this in last year, and we're actually working on putting together a best practices handbook that draws on the best practices from these people who have been doing this for longer than we have and have developed a lot of strategies that we would like to roll out to our partners around the world who are working in a variety of operating environments, not only in the US and in Western Europe, but also in places where this conversation is a lot further behind or a lot more challenging due to war, conflict, humanitarian disasters that are keeping women in less of a position to take on expert roles. So we maybe selfishly are drawing from the expertise around the table so that we can spread it out wider, including to places like Iraq, Ukraine, and others.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. So I've been at Bloomberg for 26 years, and we also have been aware of this issue for quite some time. I would say we first started a real initiative back in 2010 as part of a women's leadership push, and we had someone who actually started counting the number of women's voices in our enterprise stories. And like some of the other efforts that we had done over the years, it kind of worked for a little while. People kind of paid attention, and it kind of died out. We tried to build a list of women experts, and it wasn't kept up, and it just kind of faded away. And so back in at the end of 2017, we decided that we wanted to really understand where the newsroom stood in terms of the actual data, in terms of the actual representation, just to see really how we were doing. And we measured this both in terms of the women we were bringing on TV as outside guests and in terms of the stories that we had that were citing a woman expert. And the numbers really surprised us. And I think that that's what really triggered a bigger effort. What we found was that 10% of our outside guests on Bloomberg TV were women, which means that 90% were men, which is low. We also found that we were, from our internal guests, from Bloomberg staff, that we were bringing on to do commentary on TV was only about 28%. So that was one thing. Then we looked at the stories. We had created a button that when you publish a story that quotes or cites a woman expert, it would be tagged to a certain code. And we found that only 2.5% of our front page or top stories actually cited a woman expert, which meant that 97.5% of our stories cited not a single woman expert or quoted a single woman expert. So that's what really drove us to develop a broader initiative. From the, in terms of our print stories, we created this button. We started tracking the numbers regularly. We made it trackable so that individual reporters and editors could see what they were actually doing, and so that managers could hold them accountable. And then we started looking at our TV programming, program by program, region by region, bureau by bureau, and going through the numbers daily and weekly and monthly with the bookers and with the programmers. We also built a database that is now more than 2,300 names globally of women experts across business and finance, and are finding ways to make that searchable within our system. We also set a policy saying that Bloomberg journalists couldn't join panel discussions, whether it's organized by Bloomberg or outside, unless there was gender diversity on the panel. And all of this was intended to say we cared about raising the voices of women experts, and that we were serious about it and we were taking a stand. And then finally, we put in place a media training program to train women experts to address one of the concerns that we were hearing, which was that some of the women that we were trying to bring on TV said that they weren't prepared or comfortable doing that. All that said, and I can get into any of those issues more in detail later, now our outside guests on Bloomberg TV, we've gone up to 18% of our outside guests are women, and more than 40% of our internal guests are women. And we have set some targets for this year so that it goes that we get it even more. But we feel like we've made progress. There's a lot of work still to be done, and we understand that there's a lot of challenges, particularly in the area of coverage that we focus on.
This is interesting to hear from Laura, because when I started looking at this in 2016 and I started having lots of conversations at the BBC, often I would talk to people who would say, well, of course we think this is a worthy goal, and of course we're mindful of it, and we think we're making progress. And I'd go, oh, great, tell me, how's your progress going? Like, how's things changed? And no one had any numbers. Like, there just wasn't the data to tell us where the success stories were or where the work to be done was. So we discovered these teams doing brilliant work that no one knew about. Sometimes they didn't even know about it because they weren't measuring it, so they didn't know how well they were doing. But more often, I have a folder in my Outlook which is just full of editors who joined 50/50 who said, we thought we were doing a lot better than we were. And almost everyone who measures gets a shock, but the shock provides a foundation for the discussion, and it's a counter to the false narrative that we've made progress if in fact you haven't. And I include my program on that. When we started measuring, we were like, oh goodness, we thought we were a lot better than this. But having the data doesn't resolve the problem, but it provides a much more solid foundation on top of which you can then try and address it.
And I think that's really interesting, and I'd like to follow up on this question because not every company is like Bloomberg that can create an API and say, okay, let's build this into our CMS and let's track this in an automated way. And I know that, Ross, that's not how you started, and it was very simple. So can you just even walk through from the steps of how did that counting start, and as a quote-unquote tool, how lo-fi did it actually get?
It went really lo-fi. So the way we count is if someone contributes to our journalism, whether it's broadcast or digital, then they count as one. So if they're on the TV for 10 minutes or 2 minutes, they still count as one. If you count time, it becomes a lot more onerous in terms of workload. We build spreadsheets we have templates, lots of different templates of spreadsheets. Each team that joins, we give them a spreadsheet which matches their content, and they're obliged to measure their content as they make it. And crucially, because it's a very simple system, the people who make the content measure it. And this is really important because I'd noticed other diversity monitoring systems, the monitoring was being done by someone aside from the newsroom, and as a consequence, the journalists were either never getting the data or they were getting it 3 weeks later, by which time they couldn't remember the program that had been monitored. So we use spreadsheets, and then we have a 2-tier data collection system. So teams monitor themselves daily, and then once a month, every team taking part is obliged to share their monthly figures in a dashboard that we built that's available across the BBC. And this is a crucial element of what we've done, and I suspect Laura's found this with individual reporters. If you operate a peer group dynamic and complete transparency, it motivates teams to do better because they like to be seen to be doing well, but also if they're doing badly, how they're doing is in public view, and you tend to not to have to speak to them about it because they find that if they're making a TV news program with 25% women in it, that's not a comfortable place to be if your numbers are out there and available across the BBC. And so that is the kind of second tier of our data collection system. And that's worked very well indeed. And I guess on top of that, which is not technology, I would add, so we have a bot that can measure sourcing in digital articles. We started using it and we stopped using it because we noticed that the teams using the automation were not doing as well as the teams who are manually counting, because the act of counting engaged them directly with the issue, while as when the bot's just doing its work, you kind of get on with your day and you wouldn't necessarily connect with that data in the same way. So it might seem very, well, it is very lo-fi to kind of keep the bot going but not use it as the primary data collection tool. But we just started to see that performance dropped off the more we automated it. So even though it's this huge project, 20 organizations around the world, 4,000 journalists in the BBC, it's still the manual act of counting that's at the heart of it.
Yeah, and I would add to that, I mean, we did create a button that a person pushes if there's a woman expert quoted or cited in the article. And very specifically, we didn't want to do an automated system because we wanted to be as transparent and accurate as we could be. I think sometimes with these automated systems that are quoting he said or she said, you end up, every time Hillary Clinton spoke during the U.S. presidential campaign, that would be counted, and it wouldn't mean that anyone was actually going out and getting a source. And if you're really trying to affect change in terms of your sourcing, which is about the perspectives and opinions that you're bringing into the story, you want to make sure that you're actually addressing sourcing. So I think that is important, that there is human involvement. And the other thing I was going to say is that in terms of the programming, and I agree with Ross that it's important, almost from a competitive standpoint for the different programs to see how each other is doing. It also allows you to figure out, okay, why is it that this program in the Middle East is not able to get as many women experts on as, say, this program in the UK, and start looking at solutions for that particular program. It allows you to drill down and not just look at the macro numbers.
Yeah, so we have situations where a certain team will suddenly, have a breakthrough. They'll be stuck in the 30s, for instance, and then suddenly they're leaping up to 45, 50% female sources, and we'll immediately go to them and say, okay, what happened here? We'll find out what happened, and then we'll make sure we connect them with other content teams operating in similar areas, both for inspiration and practical advice. So science, for instance, been a huge success for 50/50. The BBC Science Unit is, I think, last month, averaging 49%, which is just way above where they were originally. And we want to know why, because actually general news programs like mine cover science a lot. So we're like, okay, what have you done that, because we're still struggling? And the thing that's been exciting, and I'm sure you guys have found the same thing, is that, of course, I didn't invent the idea of monitoring, and I didn't invent the idea of caring about this, but it turned out there were loads of people doing great work in the BBC, and no one knew about it. And that was the crazy thing, that we weren't even making the most of the work that was already being done.
And I think, again, this leads back to a follow-up question of having champions to drive it forward. And Ross, definitely you have been a champion to drive it forward. And I think, within Bloomberg, there have been, at the top management leadership level, there's been a decision to make this a business priority, and that gender diversity and also diversity and inclusion would be part of an actual business case. And so I would like to just touch upon, if you could, briefly, from the organizational point of view, what is the business case for diversity when it comes to including sources, and not just gender, but also if you want to talk also about the New Voices initiative as well.
So, I think the only argument that I can ever make for why this is important to journalists is the journalistic argument, which is that this improves our content, this improves our fairness, balance, limits our bias, helps us find stories we wouldn't have otherwise found, gives our readers and viewers perspectives that they deserve to hear, and for whatever reason we haven't been providing them. So that's usually the argument that is the only one that I can understand, and that makes sense, and it fits into an overall strategy in our newsroom where we're trying to improve our representation both in terms of gender and in terms of ethnic diversity at every level of the workforce. in making the statement that it matters who's reporting the story, who's writing the story, who's editing the story, who's deciding where the story plays and on what platform it runs, as well as whose perspectives and opinions we're drawing on to tell the stories. So we are really looking at our workforce at every level, again, in every bureau, in every region, to see what the representation looks like at the reporter level, at the editor level, at the manager level, and so forth. Doing strategies to help improve that, just as we're trying to improve the representation and the sourcing.
Ross?
So I'd make 2 points. One would be to echo what Laura's saying, which is, when I go to work at the BBC every day, I'm going to work because I care about reporting and analysing the world we live in, and if you just do that through one perspective, you're going to be struggling to do that as well as you can. And so when I'm talking to teams at the BBC, we very much frame this in terms of making your journalism better, not you really ought to do this, which largely doesn't cut it. The second thing is, if you look at lots of market research, not just around news, but around brands more generally in the UK, Ipsos Mori's done some stuff on this, the intolerance of a lack of diversity in the under 40s in the UK is just going like this. And so whether you're a clothing brand or a music brand or a news brand, if you don't look like the diverse world in which under 40s live, they're not going to put up with it. We also have research saying, for instance, the biggest group who watch TV in the UK are lower income white women in the north of England, and they also care very, very little about diversity. When they turn on the TV, they have other things which drive what they choose to watch. But if you look at the market research around under 40s, and the BBC quite rightly is very, very focused on younger audiences at the moment, if you don't look like their world, they're probably not going to stick with you. And so there's a very strong case that it makes your journalism better and it makes your journalism more popular, which for most of us who are journalists is something we're interested in.
And the third piece of that is that it makes journalism more trustworthy. People feel, we've seen over and over in surveys, that people trust media more, that they feel is representative of the diversity of their community. So that's a point that we always try to stress when we're trying to make the business case with outlets that we might be working with about why this is worth their time. Trust matters.
Yeah, and the thing we hear, and I'm sure you guys hear this as well, when people start doing 50-50, initially they get a shock because they measure where they are, and that's not normally a great surprise. But then they start seeing their programming or their content changing, and they get excited by it. So if you ask the people who make my program, they'd say, forget whether it's the right thing to do or not, our program's just better. Yeah. And that suddenly becomes something that's exciting, rather than something that you're doing because management are leaning on you because you have to do it, and it flips the dynamic around.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that when you start seeing stories being written that otherwise wouldn't have been written, or commentary and stories that otherwise wouldn't have been there, it makes a big difference for the journalists. So one of our reporters who started looking for more women bond fund managers came up with the story that, in this particular sector of bonds, they're actually outperforming all of their peers, and wrote this incredible story about how they were outperforming and quoting them. And these were people we wouldn't have otherwise talked to, for instance, and our reporter who covers Facebook sent me a story the other day and said, look, I found 3 new women experts to talk about Facebook, and sent me the story to show how those quotes fit into the story. So people were getting kind of excited that they were finding new perspectives as well.
And I think that that really nicely lays out the question about demand, and it certainly is not just a moral issue; it's a business issue, and there are many reasons, for the journalism community to want to improve their products and the quality of what they're producing. Let's switching sides a little bit to supply, and it's all very well to make a commitment to try to achieve certain targets, to work to integrate that throughout the programming. On the other hand, there is a supply issue, and that is in finding expert sources, women who will put themselves forward as expert sources. There tends to be a reluctance, and this is something I know that Bloomberg certainly has been working in a very concerted way to address, particularly when it comes to sort of the business and finance sources. But I'd also like to hear about what Internews is also doing, and of course, Ross, if you want to jump in. But so we'll start again with you, Laura, if you could address that.
So as we were sort of starting really digging deep into why we weren't getting more women experts into our content, we started hearing a lot of excuses. Sometimes the journalists would say, we just can't find the people, and then we would say, well, here's a whole list of people that you can tap into. Then we would hear, well, actually, they don't feel comfortable going on TV, or they don't feel like they have the right training, or their comms people aren't fronting them for stories because the firm itself doesn't feel confident that they can go on, or there were these various different reasons. And we felt like the one thing that we could address in a very proactive way was this issue of media training. So we began funding a media training initiative that started last year in 4 cities in New York, Toronto, Hong Kong, and London. And we trained, we provided the funding with an outside, a third-party vendor to do the training. And we provided, it was like 4-hour one-on-one training for about 60 women, all business and finance leaders. And this year, we're expanding that effort to San Francisco, Sydney, Mumbai, and Dubai. And in every case, these are major hubs of our TV programming. And the intent here is not necessarily that they end up going on Bloomberg TV, but that we're addressing a supply problem in the industry, and hopefully helping any media organization that's trying to raise the voices of women experts. But what we found is that there's this kind of feedback effect where just with the firms just realizing that this is something that's important, and that it's so important to us that we are pushing forward with this initiative, that they're starting to, on their own, just kind of push forward more women into the space, and basically people that they may not have otherwise elevated to that platform, and that's happening more often now. So that's what we're doing.
Yeah, in terms of supply side challenges, Internews runs into this constantly in places around the world where we work, particularly countries where women have been systematically excluded from public life, or where cultural norms have prevented them from rising to the source of positions where they might be considered able to get that expert level education or work experience. And we try to deal with this in a couple of ways. One of them is by helping women launch their own media outlets. In a lot of places, women are more likely or more able to speak with other women about their work, their perspectives, opinions, and the challenges in their lives, and how they see the world from the position that they're in. We, for instance, in the Central African Republic, worked with Muslim and Christian women in a particularly dangerous neighborhood in Bangui, in the capital, to form a radio station that's run almost exclusively by women. And they're able to cover women's participation and the leadership roles that women are taking in the peace process that tend not to be covered in the more mainstream media there, but are actually very important to moving things forward. Another way we do it is by helping journalists and editors reconsider what kind of voices are worth hearing from, or who can be considered an expert on a particular topic. In places where women more women don't have the academic or the professional credentials, but they're still actually doing the work. Like, for instance, in Tajikistan, where a lot of the men have gone to Russia or to other places for migrant labor, the women are the ones running the businesses, and they don't have maybe credentials to show that, but they certainly have the work experience to be considered an expert on certain topics.
I think on the supply side, I'm going to say 2 things which may sound contradictory, but hope it'll make sense. I find that supply is often offered up by journalists as a reason that they can't equally represent women. And on one level, I just don't accept it. We're talking about half of the world. And, to give you one example, I anchored the BBC's coverage of the Dutch elections a couple of years ago, and the guy who was setting up the whole week's coverage said to me, it's got to be at least 50% women, please, all contributors. And he came back a couple of weeks later and he goes, I've done a huge trawl. It's not quite 50%, it's like 65% men, but I just couldn't find, the people I was looking for. And I was like, this is the Netherlands, really? You and me are going to sit down with Twitter for a couple of hours and we're just going to sort this out. And we did. And it seems to me that all of us in our journalistic lives, in different ways, achieve very difficult things every day. There are some things about journalism which are completely non-negotiable. So in the context of BBC broadcast journalism, we've got to be impartial, our language has got to be correct, our facts have got to be correct, our production standards have got to be correct. These things aren't things that I can compromise on. I'll be given my marching orders. So if you start putting the fair representation of women in with that list and saying this is just something we have to do, then magic things start happening. And one of the things I observed as I was thinking about starting 50/50 was that I call it the constant state of trying, where you accept the goal and you accept it's not possible. And as long as you signal that the goal would be great to reach, as long as you're trying to get there, it doesn't actually matter if you are getting there. And I was interested in what would happen if you said, no, we actually just have to do this. And when you do that, interesting things start happening. But then you are right, there is sometimes a supply issue. One thing we encourage all BBC journalists to do now, which we never used to do, is if we find one woman who's an expert in an area, we ask her, who else in your area is an expert? And almost always they're willing to give you other contacts you haven't got. So we enlist the help of the contacts we have to expand, and that's been a huge success. And we've also started doing these amazing events. I can take no credit for this. These are other people involved in 50/50, where they do open evenings within BBC newsrooms, and they say, well, we're having an open evening on business in Cambridge or wherever it might be, and they let it be known in the business community in Cambridge and around that if you want to come in and meet BBC journalists and have a glass of wine, you can. And these have just been hugely successful and they've actually countered the idea that women don't want to put themselves forward. I mean, Flip's here from ABC. Maybe she'll talk in a minute about what they did, but actually our experience is if you give people a very clear invitation and say, we'd like to hear from you, actually there are plenty of people who will.
Yeah, and I'll give an example from the Middle East, where I'm going to Dubai next week to launch our media training initiative there, and we've heard a lot from the Bureau that it's very difficult to find women experts for panels that we're doing in the region, that the TV programming that we do from Dubai every day, the representation is lower than the average globally. And so we want to go and just sort of say, okay, we're going to help you realize this is not the case. And we've just, we're one news organization, so it's okay. Maybe the journalists there haven't necessarily found all the people that are prepared to speak to us, but we're going to help discover them. And we have a great group coming in that I'll be talking to. And I think just in these efforts, just by being conscious about this and being intentional about it, we're able to make significant shifts in behavior.
And just one example of quite a few I could give you, BBC Arabic's top TV news show, NewsHour, they almost didn't join 50/50 because they were saying, look, the cultural and political obstacles are too great. I think when they first joined us, they were below 15% women. In March, they were 44%. And once you, to use Laura's word, once you make it intentional and once you start monitoring it every day, things that felt totally out of range start kind of opening up in quite an exciting way.
And that leads on to our second last question, and we are running out of time. We want to make sure that there's enough time for questions. But if you could each say, for the journalists and editors in the room today, one concrete step that each could take to improve that and be more aware and be more conscious of the sources and the gender and being more diverse in terms of who you're bringing in as experts, what would that be? What are the simple day-to-day steps that could be taken?
I mean, I'm just going to say in general, take more risks and be comfortable with taking risks. I think sometimes people don't bring on people who haven't already become a newsmaker or whose name is not already known because they're afraid of I don't know what. But there are so many influential leaders out there, women leaders who economists, fund managers, analysts that we have not taken the risk to bring on air or bring into our stories, and that if they can just overcome that issue within themselves, because I really do think it's slightly self-censorship, that we can make progress. So that's my one piece of advice.
I would say launch a simple tracking mechanism. The manual tracking, just having an editor say to their journalists, okay, every week I want you to count up the number of female expert sources that you've used and report it to me. And sometimes you don't need to do anything more than that and to sort of shock people into realizing that this is a problem and to start doing something about it without needing any other accountability mechanism.
So I'd echo those two. I'd add, about a year ago, I went to Washington, D.C., and we had a meeting with National Geographic about 50/50, and we met this guy, and he kind of leant back and he went, "You've given everyone a permission structure." And I said, "Have we? I've never heard this phrase before. What do you mean?" And one of the things I've tried to do at the BBC is to get the very most senior people in the BBC to signal that they know about 50/50 and they like it and they approve of it. Not to take it over, it's still a grassroots voluntary project, but just to let it be known that they're keen on it. And Tony Hall, the top of the BBC, and everyone else in senior management has been brilliant at doing that. They've been absolutely fantastic. And by letting it be known, and if you're all news leaders, you could do this too, if you let it be known to your journalists that you like this and you want it and that you support it, suddenly people who definitely wouldn't have had the confidence to say out loud in an editorial meeting, how about when we talk about Islamic State, we don't talk to a man for the 28th time in a row, we talk to a woman who's an expert on this. People were nervous about saying it out loud, and the BBC management have been brilliant about signaling that they want people to say it out loud. And if you're a leader in news, that's one thing I would do.
That's great, thank you. And I think I would just add to this that it is also important to recognize your own unconscious bias, and that we all have it. We're human. This is an innate part of human nature, and when you are aware of it and recognize it, then you can check it and make sure that you're making conscious choices, not to just fall into habitual selection of sources and whatnot. Thank you, everyone. This has been really interesting. We will open up the floor now to questions, and I think there are a couple of roving microphones around. And yes, we've got our first question there.
Hi, Annette Young from the 51% of France 24. And hi, Laura. We've been on a panel before. I've got a question for both you, Laura, and also for Ross. I am curious about management and their support, and I noted that Ross talked about the degree of support he's received from senior levels of management. But as Laura and I know, people change. Matt Winkler was responsible for the rollout of your diversity policy at Bloomberg. He's no longer there. I'm curious to know if the same degree of enthusiasm and support still exists, and how important it is for those measures to continue. For Ross, I have a question in terms of getting people on board, getting men on board. Let's be blunt, alpha males, which there are a fair few in a newsroom, it's sometimes hard to get them to understand the importance of this. I'm just wondering anecdotally whether you can tell us of any personal experiences you've had in getting your, as we would say in Australia, your mates to understand how important it is.
I'll let Laura go first.
Okay, all right. So the support of senior management is critical and essential. Our chairman, Peter Grauer, has consistently been pushing us to improve our representation, particularly on TV. And he personally actually looks at the list of guests every day and has taken a great interest in that. Matt is no longer the editor-in-chief. He is, however, still in the building as our editor-in-chief emeritus, and I talk to him regularly, and he's super supportive, and he's still going around speaking on these issues. John Micklethwaite, who replaced him, the reason we created a new job. My job is a new job, and it's a very senior level job that combines diversity, talent, training, and standards, and it allows me from a very senior perch, and I report directly to him, to carry these initiatives out. So I would say, we've had ebbs and flows in the newsroom over the years. As I said before, some of these efforts started and then kind of fizzled. But my feeling, and I've been there 26 years, my feeling is that I'm not going to let this go until it sticks. And I think that there is a lot of management support.
So in terms of persuading people, I used to work in a way where I would really take on people who weren't convinced of how I thought we should make radio news or TV news. I used to have lots of kind of battles with people, and it was quite exhausting. And when I started 50/50, I made a really strict rule, and I've stuck to it, which was that I wasn't going to really try and persuade anyone. I was going to prove that it was possible, I was going to prove that it worked, and I was going to have conversations who wanted to get up with people who wanted to get on with it, and if people didn't want to get on with it, so be it. And as a consequence, I get invited to talk about 50/50 in lots of different scenarios inside and outside the BBC, and it's always the softest of sells. I just go in and talk about what I've been doing and why I'm excited about it and why other people are excited about it, and I go, there you go, here's my email address. If you fancy doing it, let me know. If you don't, that's fine. And that can take a lot of the fear out of it. I think also, quite rightly, BBC journalists have questions about, well, if we start changing our sourcing practices, will that compromise quality? And as such, you just need to reassure them by pointing to all the different teams who are using it, who are still maintaining the same quality or have increased their quality since then. So that can, that can make things a lot easier. Also, and I've had this a couple of times where men have come to me and they've been very cross about it. Their team's doing it, but they're very cross about it. And I've just said, you don't have to do this. This is not a management diktat. This is, you don't have to do this. You can just not do it. There's going to be no consequence of that. And that is incredibly effective at just taking the heat out of it. And I think when I was younger, I'd have had quite a completist view of this, which is, for this to be a success, 100% of BBC journalists will need to be doing it, otherwise I've not managed to get it anywhere. And I've kind of gone completely the other way, and I don't really mind if there are 5 or 10% of BBC journalists who, for whatever reason, don't want to do that, because there's 90% of us who are on a mission, and that's exciting. And so just not having the fight has been remarkably good for my state of mind, but I think actually quite complimentary for the project as well. And it's not a lie, it's not spin to say if a team was to drop out of 50/50, they're not going to get a phone call from Tony Hall or someone else at the top of the BBC. It's not going to happen. It's a genuine offer. If people want to stop, they can stop. But the problem is, to Laura's point, once you start noticing it and once you start feeling it, it stings. And one of the reasons that I started 50/50 was I'm from Cornwall in the southwest of England, and I was driving home from London, and I heard a whole hour-long edition of a very famous radio program, the BBC Makes News program, and it only had men on it. And the thing that I was furious about was not that this had occurred, because I could almost understand how it did, but I knew there wouldn't have been a big row at the end. While as if we'd done a politically imbalanced program, there would have been all hell to pay. And so one of my goals has been to try to sensitize us all to this issue. And I find that once you're sensitized, the rest starts falling into place. And as such, the data does a lot of the work for you.
That's great. Two very different approaches to push towards the same goal. Very interesting. Anyone else on the...
Yeah, hi, my name is Dagmar Kaspan from the Prague Media Point Conference. I have a question. Laura touched upon this briefly. If you could elaborate a little bit on how this strategy falls into, if and how it falls into somehow your staffing strategy, diversity in the newsroom and in management positions, and if you see it as important.
So, again, from my perspective, it's all interlinked. I think that if you're trying to get balance in your coverage and bring as many different perspectives to what stories you're telling and how you're telling them, it has to go across the workforce as well as in the sourcing. So I meet regularly with managers about their representation at every level, and what you see, and I am sure this is pretty common for most newsrooms, which is that where you're going to see parity most closely is at the reporting level. And as you get to the editing level, the senior editing level, the management level, the gap, you start seeing this gap. So one thing that we've done, because I was quite concerned about the fact that we had a dearth of women editing our most ambitious enterprise stories. So these are stories that go in one of our magazines or are stories that are several weeks in the making. The percentage of women editors, I still don't totally understand why this is the case, but it's just very, very hard to find women who are in those roles. And at our organization, it looked like a problem, and we had some reporters complaining about it. So I started a workshop, a senior editor workshop for women. I just completed the third one right before I came here. And we choose 10 women globally who have strong editing skills, but don't feel comfortable editing that kind of story. And it's a global, we picked 10 women globally, and the workshop focuses both on very hands-on editing tips and instruction, as well as leadership and sort of confidence building for themselves. And I have to say it's been very effective. Many of the women that have gone through that workshop have already been promoted, and several have handled magazine stories since then. So that's a little step, maybe. It's not the answer to everything, but it's at least sort of saying, okay, I've looked at this level, I see there's a problem, what can we do to address it? And we have different strategies for other things. For instance, for some reason, editors for economics coverage and economists generally in our coverage, there's fewer women. So, we've talked about how can we help with our recruiting efforts there more significantly. So one of the benefits of looking level by level is that you can kind of see where the imbalances are and think of strategies to try to address that.
So I have a slightly different experience, which is that I'm a news anchor. I'm not a manager, and as such, the BBC has huge pieces of work in place in terms of diversifying its staff and also making sure that the senior management is diversified as well. I'm not involved in that at all. I started this project, and it continues to be ultra practical. Like, I'm on a mission, I want to get on with this now, we don't have to wait 3 years to fix it. Evolving the makeup of your staffing in a big organization, even when senior management are totally committed to it, which they are at the BBC, that's a long piece of work and an important piece of work. And hopefully it complements what we're all trying to do with 50/50. But if I'd waited for that piece of work to play out, I could have been waiting for a while. So I was like, no, let's do this. So for instance, a media organization came to us last week and said, okay, we'd like to join to 50/50. We can have them up and running like on Monday. We're very nimble, we're very quick, and we're just getting on with it. And so while I think what we're doing complements the longer term staffing evolution that a lot of media organizations are in, there is a risk that if you tie all diversity projects into one thing, that actually some progress that can be made immediately gets pushed back because of longer-term projects, if that makes any sense. Could I also just mention, because it just sprung into my mind, and I should have mentioned when we were talking about supply, we now have 2 massive PR agencies signed up to 50/50, and they are monitoring who their clients put up for interview. And this is a massive new area for us that we're just getting into, and this is the kind of flip side of the coin. And we're very excited about that, because if you have big brands, big corporates monitoring who they put up for interview, it's not going to change journalism, but it's going to help.
And I'd just like to say, I mean, Roz and Laura, you've both shared so many great best practices, and I'm really excited to be able to share many of these with our partners around the world. I'd also like to invite all of you who may be working on initiatives like this in your own newsrooms, or who have specific strategies or solutions that you've implemented. If you would like to contribute to this handbook, either through an interview or contribution of a chapter, or anything like that, please find me after the panel. I would love to get your contact information and put you in touch with the people who are working really in depth on this project.
I think 2 points to that. What Ross said, underscores that this is something that needs to be a multifaceted approach. That there are, easier wins. There are sort of the long game, and one should not preclude starting the other. We need different individuals championing different approaches and piloting different ways to push toward the same goal. I also think it's crucial, and you touched upon this, Laura, in your answering your last question. But Bloomberg has made a point to follow through on its commitment by actually giving you the authority, putting you in a position that you are able to actually enforce change. And your word, there's You're not just a champion that can try to influence soft power. If you say we need to do this, people need to listen. And if there needs to be training, and you can actually push that through. And that obviously also, again, to answer your question, is so crucial in bringing about that longer-term organizational change.
And one other dynamic we're experimenting with, that you can come back to me in a month and ask how I found it, is that 12 months ago, the BBC committed to publishing our 50-50 data for this month, regardless of how it is. So in the middle of May, we're going to publish how we're doing, and the fact that we all of us inside the BBC know that all of you and anyone else who wants to look at it is going to be able to see how we're doing has a certain way of focusing the mind.
That's great. Okay, I think we have time for one or two more questions, if there's anything else from the floor.
Earlier, it's a question for us when you said that the monthly update about the project is shared within the BBC. I assume it's not public for the general public. So I was wondering why, if there was a conversation within the BBC or the project, why did you choose not to share? Where are the pros and cons?
So it's a reasonable question. My original idea in 2016 was that every team would publish its monthly data on Twitter as a matter of course, and it became clear that for some teams that was going to be a deal breaker. And when I was trying to think about how can I, coming back to what I was saying earlier, I made a list of all the reasons why teams were going to say no. And I needed to make sure I had a good answer to each. So I wanted to make the point of entry as low as possible. And for some of them, just the idea of monitoring and it being available inside the BBC was uncomfortable. Several asked if they couldn't do that, and I said, I'm afraid it comes with the project. And it became clear that if I insisted on publishing each team's data publicly, that could become a distraction and cause upset that was going to disrupt what was a very young and fragile project. And so for that reason, I decided not to, because teams were telling me, we don't want to go this far yet. Let's see how April goes. Maybe in the future we'll do it. But there was nothing guaranteed about this project. The more likely outcome was I was going to try it and it wasn't going to work. And so I needed to, a bit like a startup, you needed to get momentum. And it was clear that full public transparency, a lot of my colleagues were not going to be comfortable with. And so I backed away from it.
One last question. I think the gentleman up here at the front.
All right, can I please stand up? Two things. One, to bear quick testimony to the impact of Bloomberg strategies, to which I'm only recently involved. I have had the experience of being invited to moderate a debate between two men at an outside event and being blocked by Laura from doing so. And boy, did that have an effect on the organisers when I explained why I wasn't going to be able to do this for them. So it does have a ripple effect. One more practical question. I fear they probably just brought in some other useless, boring man like me, but you never know.
But I would say that there's lots of examples where it has changed. So
yes, I think it might change in future.
For being so understanding.
But you didn't give me a choice. But anyway, the other question, more pertinently, what happens when attempts at gender fairness conflict with other versions of fairness? The specific example I have in mind is I used to do a video 4 times a week for my old employer. We had a rule at that point, given that the City of London, where I was at that point, is extremely male-dominated. We wanted to get at least 1 of the 4 slots to a woman each week and try for 2. In the case of foreign exchange, where there are about 20 houses doing foreign exchange, one of them is run by a woman, and I got to know her very well. She's a very nice person. She's very good at foreign exchange. But it meant that we were hugely overrepresenting one organization compared to others. What do you do when attempting to get gender bias runs into problems of fairness in other areas?
So this won't, am I still on? Hello. This may not answer the question totally, but just some of the things that we've thought about in this space. So we do sometimes set certain parameters for our coverage that may or may not make sense. And I would say this is also the case when it comes to recruiting and when it comes to filling board seats and this sort of thing. So for instance, on corporate boards where there's a big push for more representation, it's been said that perhaps everyone, that the boards are looking for the same kind of person, and so since there aren't enough, like maybe they only want CEOs and there's only 5% of S&P 500 CEOs are women, how are you going to find enough women to fill the corporate board seats? Well, maybe you need other kinds of leaders to be representative that are also going to give that board a fair, distribution of perspectives that are going to be effective for the company. So I would say in this case, I mean, perhaps it depends what the mission of the panel or the programming was, but there may be an expert that's not necessarily in that exact title in another space, whether, that might make sense for that discussion to be interesting, and so that we may be limiting ourselves just by a title or by certain parameters that we put on the coverage. And I'll give one example of this with a panel, which is where we did affect gender representation. It was in Washington. One of our male anchors was asked to moderate a panel between a Republican leader and a Democratic leader over immigration, and they were both men. And I was like, oh my God, does this have to be done this way? There must be. I mean, in this environment with all these women that have just run for Congress, we can't find a woman expert here. And he was like, well, these are the most important voices for immigration. But he pushed back, and the organization ended up getting Maxine Waters to join the panel, and it was a much better conversation. So it was just about the fact that was the narrowness. That's my view on it, but Ross may have.
And Ross, you need to be very quick because we need to
Okay, I'll be
wrap
very
up.
quick. So when I was setting up 50/50, I picked out about 5 or 6 of my most respected colleagues who I looked up to a great deal and said, I need to just run a few things by you in terms of what I'm planning with this project. And one was I was planning to measure work to weekly totals. And it became very clear that if you work to weekly totals, there will be times when you would be under pressure to reach 50%, but it didn't fit the subject or people's availability. So we changed it to monthly totals, which allows for the ebb and flow of subjects and of people's availability, and we felt that was a much more reasonable thing. So on any given day, we're not saying to BBC teams, that story has to be 50% women, that program has to be 50% women. We're saying across your month of endeavors, we think it's reasonable for you to be 50%, and that allows for situations where on a given subject or a given day, it's not realistic to do it.
Thank you so much, Ross, and thank you to all of our panelists for joining us today. Thank you all for fighting the post-lunch fatigue and joining us. And please do feel free to come talk to the panelists individually. We do need to leave the room, but they'll wait around in the hallway for a little bit. Thank you.